The people of Laramie have always carried their stories in hushed tones, as if the wide-open plains themselves had ears. The land stretches endlessly, a sea of grass and wind, so quiet that even the crunch of boots against dry soil feels too loud. Out there, silence is not peace, it is pressure, heavy and watchful, like someone is holding their breath, waiting. And in that silence, people claim they sometimes hear something else. A sound so unnatural it can only belong to something no one dares to name. It begins faint, almost like teeth chattering in the cold. But then it grows, slow and steady, like stones being ground together. Some say it's the sound of bones being crushed into dust. The people call it the bone grinder. Most folks laugh at the name, shake their heads and call it another backwoods ghost story. Just a way for old men to scare kids away from wandering too far into the grasslands at night. After all, the plains can be cruel. They swallow light, turn footsteps into echoes, and stretch the horizon so far that a person can feel lost within minutes. You don't need monsters out here. Nature itself will strip you down, freeze your lungs, and leave your bones scattered under the open sky. And yet, the whispers never die. They grow with each generation, stitched into warnings from parents, carried like curses from one campfire to the next. The stories change, depending on who tells them. Some say the bone grinder is a man, long dead, but never buried. A prospector who lost everything in the mines, his body broken in a cave-in, his spirit cursed to roam the plains forever, searching for bones to replace his own shattered ones. Others claim it isn't human at all, but something older, born from the land itself. A spirit that feeds on marrow and fear. Whatever it is, the one thing that never changes in the stories is the sound. That grinding, gnawing sound. The noise that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up before you even realize you're hearing it. The sound of death before death finds you. Travelers through Laramie sometimes laugh at the locals, brushing off the warnings as superstition. They pass through at dusk, windows down, radios humming, their voices bright against the darkening plains. But there are some who never make it to their destination. Their cars are found days later, sitting on the side of the road with doors wide open. Sometimes the headlights are still on, batteries drained. Sometimes the engines are still warm, keys still dangling from the ignition. And always, the seats are empty. No luggage missing, no footprints leading away. Just an absence, sharp and echoing. People say those are the ones who ignored the whispers, the ones who laughed too loud at the story. Old-timers in town, Remember things they will not speak of when the sun is up. Ask them in daylight, and they'll shake their heads, muttering about coyotes or wolves or drifters who prey on the careless. But catch them at night, maybe with a drink in hand, and their eyes will dart to the windows as they lean in close. They'll tell you about the neighbor's boy who vanished when he followed the sound of crunching rocks one evening. They'll tell you about the rancher who found piles of fine white dust where his cattle used to graze, as if their skeletons had been ground to powder. And sometimes they'll admit that even they, strong as they are, refuse to walk the plains after dark. Not because of wolves, not because of coyotes, but because of something worse. Something that leaves no trace but a sound in the wind. On especially cold nights, when the wind slashes across the land like knives, even the bravest men lock their doors early. They keep lamps burning, whispering prayers, pretending they don't hear the faint crunch echoing through the fields. Parents tell their children to stay in bed, to never look outside if they hear the grinding. Curiosity, they say, is the quickest way to feed the grinder. Once you lean too close to the window, once you press your ear to the night, you'll never pull away. That sound will follow you, drag you, and crush you until there's nothing left. It doesn't chase. It doesn't run. It waits. And in the silence, you give yourself away. There are stories of travelers who did survive, though they never last long in town. Their eyes are sunken. Their hands tremble as they try to speak. They talk about the sound growing louder, louder, until it felt like it was inside their skulls, shaking their teeth loose. Some describe seeing a figure in the distance, taller than a man, dragging a long sack across the ground. The sack left a trail, dark and wet, and it seemed to whimper as it moved, as though something inside was still alive. Others refused to describe what they saw, muttering only that the plains should be left to the dead. None of them stay in Laramie. They leave as soon as they can, as if the longer they remain, the stronger the sound becomes. The townsfolk pretend not to notice. They patch fences, fix roofs, and smile for visitors. But their eyes are heavy with something unspoken. It's in the way they turn their backs to the wind. It's in the way they never camp on the plains, no matter how beautiful the stars. They know the bone grinder isn't just a story, though they'll never admit it outright. Admitting it would make it real, and some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. So they let the whispers do the talking. The whispers carry from one house to another, from parents to children, from the living to the dead, and the plains keep listening. There's a saying in Laramie, if you hear the grinding, you're already too close. That's why people avoid walking alone after dark. That's why children cover their ears when the wind howls. Because sometimes the wind isn't the wind at all. Sometimes it carries a warning. Sometimes it carries the promise of something sharp, merciless, and hungry. And if you've heard it once, you'll never forget it. The sound burrows into your memory, waiting, patient as the plains themselves. And still, strangers come. They drive across the vast fields, eyes wide with wonder, unaware of what lurks beneath the silence. They take photos of the rolling grass, the empty sky, the endless horizon, never realizing the land is watching them back. Never realizing the wind has already carried their names to the one thing out there that never sleeps. And when night falls, and the last light bleeds from the horizon, the plains go quiet again. Too quiet, until the sound begins, soft at first, grinding, gnawing, the promise of bones being broken, and then it grows louder, always louder, until it is all that remains. For years, the back roads of the Laramie Plains carried a reputation that no map could warn you about. Truckers said the highways were long, endless stretches of silence, and for some reason, the silence seemed heavier there than anywhere else in Wyoming. The asphalt stretched black across the pale grasslands, and if you drove too long at night, the road felt like it was pulling you deeper, as if it wanted you lost. People passed through every day, but not everyone came out on the other side. The first signs of trouble were the disappearances, strange enough that they made even the most hardened truck drivers nervous. Rigs were discovered idling by the roadside, headlights on, radios still buzzing. The driver's food was still on the seat, coffee still warm, cigarettes still burning down in the ashtray. But the driver was gone. Locals whispered that those who vanished had heard something before they disappeared. A grinding sound carried on the wind, faint at first, like rocks tumbling against one another. Some ignored it, assuming it was their engine or the tires against gravel. Others swore it grew louder the more they tried to pretend it wasn't there. And then, when it became unbearable, they would pull over, step outside to check their rig, and simply never return. That was the part that kept people awake at night. They left everything behind. Wallets, IDs, pay stubs, even family photos pinned to the visor. They walked into the night and dissolved like smoke in the air. Hunters who roamed the edges of the plains told darker stories. Some claimed to find shredded clothing caught on barbed wire, as though someone had run blindly into the fences with no care for the flesh it tore away. Others swore they saw claw-like gouges etched deep into tree trunks, high above where a man could reach, as though something tall and heavy had dragged its nails across the bark. But the detail that no one could explain, the detail that froze their blood every time they thought about it, were the blood trails. Thin rivers of red stretching across the dirt, weaving like desperate footprints. The hunters followed them, guns raised, steps slow and cautious. But the trails always ended the same way. Suddenly, no body, no tracks, no drag marks. Just a final dark smear in the grass, and then nothing. It was as though the earth itself had opened up, swallowed the victim whole, and sealed itself again, without a trace. The sheriff's office tried to keep things quiet. They told reporters it was nothing more than missing persons, a sad reality of rural highways. Maybe drifters, maybe runaways, maybe hitchhikers who didn't want to be found. They talked about wild animals, about bears or mountain lions. But everyone knew better. Mountain lions don't drag away grown men without leaving remains. Bears don't grind bones into powder and scatter them like dust. The official words couldn't erase the fear in people's eyes. And when truckers gathered in diners along the interstate, they shared their own warnings in hushed voices. They said, if you drive past mile marker 17 and you hear the grinding sound, you should keep your foot on the gas and never look back. They said, if you see fog rolling across the plains at night, don't slow down, because it isn't fog at all. It's the dust left behind by bones being crushed, carried on the wind like ash. One driver named Harrison swore he saw it with his own eyes. He was heading east toward Cheyenne when his headlights caught a man standing on the side of the road. The man was tall, far too tall, with his back turned, holding what looked like a sack over one shoulder. Harrison slowed, thinking maybe the man needed help. But as his lights drew closer, he saw the sack dripping dark liquid that left a trail across the road. The man didn't turn. He didn't wave. He didn't move at all, except for one small motion, the grinding sound that seemed to come from his very chest. Harrison panicked, slammed the accelerator, and didn't stop until he reached the next town. He left his rig parked there for days, too afraid to drive back through the plains alone. He never told the police, but the story spread, and truckers started calling that stretch of road the Grinder's Mile. No one liked taking it at night. Some refused altogether. Losing money, but keeping their lives. Stories of the vanishing travelers reached the hunters too, who already avoided the plains after dusk. They knew that land carried something unnatural, and the signs were too obvious to ignore. Deer carcasses left with bones missing, coyotes found torn apart, their skulls crushed like glass beneath some unseen weight. More than one hunter swore they found piles of bone dust gathered in places where no animal should have been. When the wind picked up, the dust would scatter, drifting through the air like snow, clinging to their coats, stinging their eyes. They would wipe their faces, spit it from their mouths, and realize with a sick lurch that the dust wasn't dirt at all. It was powdered bone. Something out there was feeding, and it wasn't stopping. It didn't matter how much the sheriff denied it, or how many excuses the officials made. People in Laramie stopped trusting the roads. Mothers warned their sons never to drive alone at night. Fathers double-checked the locks before bed. Truckers planned their routes to avoid the plains after sundown, even if it meant hours added to the trip. The plains grew emptier, quieter, except for the unlucky few who thought they could handle it. They never came back. Their rigs were found, their cabins empty, their names whispered among the missing. And still, the sound carried on the wind, faint but steady, as though the plains themselves wanted the legend alive. The strangest part, people said, was how selective the disappearances seemed. Not every driver vanished. Not every hunter found blood trails or claw marks. It was almost as if the bone grinder chose who to take, as if it listened to the fear in their voices and decided who would feed it next. Survivors, the rare ones who made it out alive, spoke of the silence right before it began. The radio would cut out, the headlights would dim, the engine would sputter as though something was draining it, and then the grinding would start, slow and deep, echoing through the air until it felt like it was coming from inside their own skull. They didn't stay to see what came next. They ran, and for some reason, they lived. But they never drove the plains again. Not once. And so the legend grew. The vanishing travelers became warnings carved into the memory of the land. The empty rigs sat like tombstones on the side of the highway. The claw marks scarred the trees as proof that something taller than a man had passed through. And the trails of blood whispered louder than any sheriff's denial. The plains were not empty. They were not safe. They were waiting. And in the waiting, something fed. Something that did not leave bones behind. Only dust carried by the wind, drifting across the night sky until it found another traveler to claim. The old man had lived long enough to see the plains change, but some things never left his memory. His name was Caldwell, a miner whose hands were scarred from years of swinging pickaxes into unforgiving stone. A man who had watched friends vanish underground and never return. He had never been much of a talker, but one night, when the fire burned low in their small cabin, and the Wyoming wind moaned against the window panes, he leaned close to his grandson and spoke words he had carried like a curse his whole life. The boy was barely 12, still young enough to believe his grandfather's stories were just old men's ramblings. But there was something in Caldwell's voice that froze the laughter in his throat. It was low, broken, as if speaking each word took a piece of him away. Caldwell told him about the year 1874, when he was a young miner working in the hills not far from Laramie. The gold rush had long faded, but stubborn men still clawed at the earth, hoping to strike veins of silver or gold. The days were long, the pay was small, but the hope of treasure kept them digging. One evening, as the crew followed a new seam, their picks broke through into a hollow chamber. At first, they thought it was another abandoned shaft, but when their lanterns cut through the dust, they saw something that made their stomachs turn. Bones, piles of them, some scattered like brill sticks, others arranged in ways that made no sense. Skulls too large for cattle, jaws filled with teeth too sharp for men, ribs twisted like branches. The miners whispered about beasts they had never heard of, about creatures that should not exist. One man, a drunk from Virginia, claimed, "Greed makes men foolish." They thought if bones were there, maybe treasure was deeper still. So they dug further. Every strike of the pick echoed like thunder inside the cavern, and each layer peeled back more of the horror. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, shapes that crawled like worms under the lantern light. The air grew heavy, colder, as if the earth itself was warning them. But miners are stubborn. They pressed on until the cave trembled, until dust rained down like ash, until a sound rose from the darkness that none of them could explain. It was not the sound of rock breaking. It was not the sound of shifting earth. It was something deeper, slower, like teeth grinding bone to powder. A sound that made every man freeze with his pickaxe mid-swing. Some claimed they felt it in their chests. They should have left. They should have sealed the cave and never spoken of it again. But by the time they stumbled out into the night, pale and shaking, it was already too late. Something had woken. The first man to vanish was the drunk from Virginia. He didn't show up for breakfast the next day, and when they went to his tent, they found only his boots, still warm, sitting neatly by the cot. No footprints led away, no signs of struggle, just silence, thick and choking. The others tried to convince themselves he had run off, too scared to keep digging. But deep down, they knew the grinding had begun. Caldwell said it followed them back to camp, at first faint, like a stone stuck in the wheel of a cart, then louder each night. Some of the miners swore they saw figures in the darkness beyond the firelight, tall shapes swaying with the wind, dragging something behind them. Men grew restless, unable to sleep, clutching their shovels as if iron could save them. And then, one by one, they started to disappear. Some vanished during their watch. Some walked into the trees to relieve themselves and never returned. The worst was when they found blood, dark and wet, but no body. Just trails that ended suddenly in the dirt, as if the earth had taken them whole. By the end of the week, only 3 men remained: Caldwell, his partner Jameson, and a boy no older than 16. They fled the camp, abandoning their tools, their tents, everything. They ran through the plains until their lungs bled, the grinding sound chasing them all the way. Only Caldwell made it out alive. Jameson and the boy never reached town. To this day, no one knows where their bones lie. The grandson's eyes widened as he listened, his breath shallow. Caldwell's voice dropped to a whisper, the firelight flickering across his lined face. "It's not a man, not an animal," he said. "It's older than both. It grinds bones to powder, and it never starves." His words hung in the air like smoke, bitter and heavy. The boy wanted to laugh, to say it was just another ghost story, but the weight in his grandfather's voice crushed any thought of mocking him. Instead, silence wrapped around them, broken only by the howling wind outside. And then, faintly, the boy swore he heard it too. A sound so small at first, he thought it was just the crack of the firewood. But then it grew, a slow, steady crunching, like teeth chewing on something hard. He glanced at his grandfather, who stared back with eyes full of dread, as if he had been waiting for this moment all his life. "You hear it, don't you?" Caldwell whispered. The boy nodded. That night, the cabin walls seemed thinner than ever. Every gust of wind rattled the windows. Every creak in the wood sounded like footsteps. The boy pulled his blanket tight around his shoulders, trying to shut out the sound, but the crunching wouldn't leave. It came from outside, just beyond the door, circling the cabin. He imagined something tall, dragging a sack behind it, the ground scraping under its weight. He covered his ears, but the sound burrowed deeper, like it was inside him now, echoing in his chest, gnawing at his bones. He wanted to scream, but he didn't dare wake his grandfather, who sat by the dying fire with eyes fixed on the door, waiting, listening, like a man who knew that once something has been woken, it never truly goes back to sleep. By morning, the sound was gone. But the boy never forgot that night. He never forgot the look in Caldwell's eyes, the tremor in his hands, the way his words seemed carved into stone. And from that day on, he knew that some stories were not just tales told to scare children. Some stories were warnings. The plains kept their secrets, buried deep under rock and dust, but every once in a while, those secrets stirred. And when they did, people disappeared. The miners had dug too deep, broken open a wound that should have stayed sealed. And what they woke was still out there, still hungry, still grinding bones to powder under the endless Wyoming sky. They say the plains are quiet, but the people who live closest to them know better. Silence is not the same as peace. Silence out there feels heavy, pressing against the chest like a weight, filling your ears until even your own heartbeat sounds too loud. That is why the grinding always stands out. It slices through the quiet like a rusted blade, an ugly sound that does not belong to the wind or the grass or the animals. Locals say if you are unlucky, you hear it before you see anything else. A sound faint at first, like a pebble turning underfoot, but then growing, scraping, until it is all you hear. Teeth crushing stone, bones breaking into powder. Once you hear it, there is no going back, because the sound means it is already near. The survivors, the rare few who lived long enough to whisper their stories, never agree on what the figure truly looks like, but they all say the same things. It is tall, too tall to be human, its body stretched by shadow, its face always hidden, as if the darkness itself wraps around it like a mask. And always, always, it drags the sacks. The survivors cannot forget those sacks, heavy and soaked, dripping red as they scrape along the dirt. Some said they heard faint rattling from inside, like bones shifting against each other. Others swore they heard muffled cries, as if something inside was still alive when the figure passed. Whatever the truth, no one ever followed the sacks long enough to find out. The moment you realize what is inside, terror roots you in place. The strangest thing about the bone grinder, people say, is that it does not behave like any predator they know. It does not rush. It does not chase. It does not claw its way toward you. It simply waits, looming, dragging those sacks, as if time means nothing to it. Fear does the rest. Your own panic pulls you closer. Your own curiosity keeps you from running until it is too late. The people who have seen it swear the air feels different when it is near, colder, heavier, as if the land itself bends under its presence. Your breath shortens, your chest tightens, and the grinding fills your ears until you can no longer tell where it is coming from. Some said they turned in circles, spinning wildly, trying to pinpoint the sound, only to realize the noise was already inside their own skulls. It was not around them anymore. It was in them. There is a story about a farmer who lived near the edge of the plains. He was known as a stubborn man, not one to believe in campfire tales. He laughed at warnings, told his neighbors that fear was for children, that the plains held nothing more dangerous than coyotes and storms. One evening, when the wind grew sharp and the sky darkened too quickly, he went out to fetch his tools. His wife begged him to stay inside, but he shook her off, muttering about superstition. Hours passed, and he did not return. His wife lit a lantern and stepped outside to call for him, her voice breaking the silence. That was when she heard it, the grinding, low and steady, moving just beyond the glow of her lantern. She swore she saw a tall figure in the field, dragging something that left a dark trail behind. Terrified, she fled inside and barred the doors, clutching her children close until morning. When dawn came, the tools were still out in the dirt, the door to the shed wide open, and a trail of white dust scattered across the grass. Her husband was never found. Another tale comes from a pair of hunters who returned from the plains, pale and shaking, refusing to speak for days. When they finally did, they described the same thing. Walking through the brush at night, their lanterns casting weak circles of light, when suddenly the forest fell silent. No owls, no wind, no crunch of leaves, just that sound, faint at first, then louder. A grinding, gnawing noise that seemed to grow with every breath they took. They froze, waiting, straining to see movement, until one of them noticed the sacks. Two of them, dragging across the dirt, wet and dripping. They backed away slowly, praying to keep quiet, but the sound followed, rattling, louder, closer, until they broke into a sprint. They ran blindly through the trees. Some people think the bone grinder does not need to chase because fear itself feeds it, that it waits, patient, knowing your own panic will pull you straight into its grasp. They say once you have heard the sound, it is already too late. It latches on to you, no matter where you run, no matter how fast. It is not bound by distance the way people are. The moment you hear the grinding, you belong to it. Days later, weeks sometimes, your body will be found missing. Your bones turn to dust, carry on the wind across the plains. That is why the locals shut their windows tight on stormy nights. That is why no one dares step outside if the wind carries more than just the howl of air. Because once the sound finds you, there is no escaping it. The strangest part, perhaps, is that some people seem drawn to it, as if curiosity or madness lures them closer, step by step, into the darkness. Survivors say it is like a trance, like a voice whispering just beyond the grinding, calling them forward. They describe their feet moving without thought, their bodies trembling, but still walking toward the sound. One woman who lived to tell the tale claimed she felt her bones ache with every step, as though the grinder was already working on her from a distance. She only survived because her brother dragged her away, fighting her every step as she screamed to be let go. She has never gone near the plains again, but her eyes never lost that haunted look, as though she still hears the grinding in her dreams. The people of Laramie do not tell these stories to amuse themselves. They tell them as warnings, lessons whispered to children before bed, prayers murmured under breath when traveling after dark. They do not speak of it loudly, for fear that naming it will invite it closer. But the stories remain, passed from lips to ears, carried through generations, and always the sound remains too. Locals say if you ever find yourself in the plains at night and the air grows too still, if your heart pounds too loud in your ears and you hear that crunching, grinding echo in the wind, do not stop. Do not look around. Do not listen too closely, because the bone grinder does not run. It does not chase. It waits. And waiting is enough, because fear is the rope that pulls you closer, step by step, until the sacks are dragging behind you, too, and the grinding becomes the last sound you ever hear. They were young, restless, and too certain that nothing in the world could harm them. That arrogance comes easy when you're 20, when death feels like something that only happens to old people or to strangers in the news. The group of 6 college kids piled into 2 dusty cars and drove out onto the plains one Friday night. Music blasting from the speakers, laughter spilling into the empty Wyoming air. Devil's Butte rose like a shadow in the distance, a jagged silhouette against the horizon. And though the locals whispered warnings about the place, to the kids, it was just another backdrop for a night of thrills. They had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Laramie had. Tales of the bone grinder, of the grinding noise that spelled the end. But to them, it was just folklore. Nothing more. What better way to prove their bravery, they thought, than to spend the night where the legend lived. They brought tents, coolers full of beer, and a single camera that one of them insisted on using to film everything. They wanted proof for social media, something to brag about when they got back to campus. The footage begins with their laughter, bright and careless. You can hear the wind rushing against the microphone. You can see the way the tall grass bends and ripples like an ocean of shadows. One girl jokes that the place looks like a horror movie set. Another boy shouts that they should call out to the grinder and see if he shows up. They all laugh, the sound high and easy, as if nothing bad could touch them. That was the first hour. As night fell, the tone shifted. You can hear it in the video. The laughter grew sharper, edged with nerves. Their ghost stories, once playful, carried a strange weight when told under the massive black sky. Their flashlight beams seemed to vanish into the dark, swallowed whole before they reached anything solid. The Butte loomed behind them, jagged rock cutting into the stars like teeth. The boy with the camera kept filming, zooming in on shadows, laughing at his own jokes. But there's a moment, around 40 minutes in, where his laughter falters. He points the camera out into the fields and says he hears something. The others laugh at him, call him paranoid, but you can see it in their eyes. They heard it too. A faint noise, low and steady, carried on the wind. It wasn't the rustle of grass or the cry of a coyote. It was heavier, uglier. A grinding noise, like teeth crushing stone. The kids tried to laugh it off, daring each other louder, forcing smiles. One girl stood in front of the camera and called out into the darkness, "Bone grinder, come get us." Her friends cheered, whooping, clapping, pretending they weren't afraid. But their voices echoed strangely, cut short, as though the night swallowed them whole. After that, the video grows harder to watch. The wind seems louder, the grinding clearer. They argue over whether to pack up and leave. One insists it's just the sound of old farm equipment on the wind. Another says it's probably coyotes chewing something. But when the boy pans the camera toward the horizon, you can see it. Something tall, a shadow moving against the grass, dragging something behind it. The laughter stops. The arguing stops. All you can hear is the grinding, louder now, closer, as if it's breathing into the microphone. The camera shakes as they start running. You can hear panicked voices, footsteps trampling the grass, the zip of tent fabric as someone tries to tear it down. Then comes the screaming, not the playful, exaggerated kind, but raw, real terror. The camera hits the ground at an angle, tilted, so you can only see grass whipping against the lens, shadows flickering in the flashlight beam. The grinding drowns out everything else, louder and louder, until it is unbearable. The footage ends abruptly, with a final scream cut short. There are no more recordings after that. Days later, when the students didn't return home, their parents called the police. Search parties went out onto the plains, combing Devil's Butte for any sign of the missing kids. They found the campsite, but it was in ruins. The tents were shredded, coolers overturned, clothes torn and scattered. The cars were still there, doors flung open, radios still faintly buzzing static, as though the batteries had been drained all at once. But the students were gone. Not a single body, not a single trace of them walking away. What the officers did find chilled them to the core. The camera, half buried in the dirt, and a trail of white dust scattered across the ground like ash. The dust trailed off into the fields and vanished. When tested, it was not dirt, not sand. It was bone. The footage was reviewed in silence, passed between officers, then hushed away, filed under missing persons. The public report mentioned only that the students had likely been victims of foul play, maybe attacked by animals or violent drifters. But the locals knew better. They had heard that grinding before. They had seen what it meant. And when the whispers spread about what was on the tape, no one wanted to watch it again. Not because they didn't believe it, but because they believed it too much, too clearly. The grinding was real, and once you heard it, you could never unhear it. Parents in Laramie now tell their children to stay away from Devil's Butte, to never mock the stories, to never call the bone grinder's name. It is one thing to fear something you don't understand. It is another to invite it closer. The kids had laughed, dared each other, called it out. And the plains had answered. People say at night you can still hear them sometimes. Faint cries carried on the wind, mixed with the grinding that drags on forever. Others swear they've seen new trails of white dust scattered around the butte, drifting across the grass like snow, vanishing before morning. They say it's what's left of the students, ground down and scattered into the land. The plains had taken them, and the bone grinder was hungrier than ever. The camera is still kept somewhere in the sheriff's office, though no one talks about it anymore. Too many strange things happened after people watched it. Headaches that never went away, dreams of tall figures dragging sacks through the night. The sound of crunching bones echoing in their ears, even in silence. The tape has not been shown again, locked away in some forgotten drawer. But the story remains, whispered by locals and fueled by fear. Devil's Butte is avoided now, even in daylight. No campers, no hunters, no truckers daring shortcuts. The land feels poisoned, haunted, its silence thicker than ever. And yet, for those foolish enough to wander too close, the sound still waits. The grinding carries across the plains, patient, merciless, pulling the curious in like moths to flame, just as it did to the college kids who thought they were untouchable, who thought legends were only stories, who never made it back. Today the Laramie plains stretch wide and silent, a sea of tall grass and black earth beneath an endless sky. But anyone who has lived here long enough will tell you the silence is not empty. It listens. It waits. Truckers who once crossed those back roads now plan their routes differently, driving the long way around, even if it costs them hours. They know better than to risk the dark stretches where engines sputter and radios fall silent. Families in town bolt their doors before sundown, curtains drawn tight, lamps left burning through the night. Children are warned not to ask questions after dark, not to press their faces against the windows when the wind howls, because sometimes the wind carries more than air. Sometimes it carries the sound that no one wants to hear, the sound that has haunted Wyoming for over a century, the sound of bones grinding into dust. Some still call it a legend, nothing more than campfire stories meant to scare children into staying home at night. But the people who live closest to the plains do not laugh at the name. They lower their voices when speaking of it, because to them, the bone grinder is not a story, it is a presence. It is what you feel when the wind dies suddenly, when the world grows so quiet, your heartbeat becomes the loudest thing in your ears. It is what explains the missing travelers, the empty rigs with engines still running, the trails of white powder scattered across the fields, like snow that melts in sunlight but never in memory. And though no one dares to admit it openly, they know deep down the plains are still hungry. The bone grinder has never stopped. It has never needed to, because fear itself keeps the stories alive, and the stories keep it fed. There is a trucker named Mason who swore he heard it just last winter. He had been driving east, his rig heavy with supplies, when the snow began to fall thick against his windshield. He kept the heater humming, the radio crackling faintly, but somewhere after midnight, everything failed at once. The radio died, the heater sputtered, and the lights dimmed until only the beams of his headlights cut into the falling snow. At first, he thought it was a mechanical issue, until he heard the sound. A low crunch, steady and deliberate, like teeth grinding stone, like a mill crushing something hard. It grew louder with each passing second, filling the cab until he thought his own bones were vibrating. He pulled over in a panic, threw the door open, and stumbled into the snow. That was when he saw it, a figure, taller than any man, dragging something heavy across the field. The sacks it pulled left long trails in the snow, trails that steamed faintly red against the white. Mason did not wait to see more. He ran back into his rig, turned the key, and prayed. The engine roared back to life as though nothing had happened. But Mason swore he could still hear the grinding in his ears hours later, even after he had crossed into town. He never drove that route again. He says the sound still follows him sometimes in his sleep, and when he wakes, his jaw aches as if he has been grinding his own teeth to dust. Families tell their own stories too. A woman in Cheyenne swore she saw a thin layer of white dust coating her porch one morning. Though it hadn't snowed in days, when she bent to touch it, the dust crumbled, too fine, too sharp, and left her fingertips dry and stinging. She swept it away quickly, but the next night she dreamed of a figure standing at the edge of her yard, dragging a sack that groaned with each step. She woke screaming, her hands clenched so tightly she drew blood from her own palms. Another family reported hearing the sound outside their farmhouse for 3 nights in a row. On the 4th morning, they found their dog's bones shattered in the yard, the body gone. Only fine powder left in the grass. They moved within a week, abandoning the land their family had owned for generations. The sheriff's office will not confirm these stories, but they will not deny them either. Ask too many questions, and you are told to leave it alone, to stop chasing shadows. But the silence in their eyes says more than their words. They know what prowls the plains, what stalks the roads after sundown. They know, and like everyone else, they are too afraid to name it. The missing persons files grow each year, but no one speaks of patterns. No one admits that the disappearances always happen near the same stretches, always after dark, always when the wind carries that grinding sound. To say it aloud would be to invite it closer, and no one wants that weight on their shoulders. So the papers print stories about runaway teens and violent storms, and the truth rots quietly beneath the soil. Yet the dust remains. Travelers speak of finding it on their windshields after passing the Butte, of breathing it in when the wind whips hard across the fields. Some claim it clings to their clothes, a fine film that tastes of metal and ash. When asked what it is, they can only shrug. But those who have lived here long enough do not need to ask. They know what the dust is. They know what happens to those who vanish without a trace. The plains do not return bodies. They return dust. And when the wind carries it across your skin, across your lips, you are swallowing the remnants of Wyoming's forgotten dead. Some say the bone grinder is not even a creature in the way we understand. Some say it is the land itself, a hunger that was born when miners dug too deep, when settlers carved into the bones of the earth and awakened something older than memory. A spirit, a curse, a force that cannot die because it is not alive. Others whisper that it was once a man, stretched and twisted into something else, cursed to feed forever, never full, never resting. No one agrees on the form, but they all agree on one thing. It never starves. Time does not weaken it. Decades pass. Generations come and go. But the grinding never stops. It only waits for the next name, the next soul, the next body to turn into dust. So today, truckers avoid the plains at night, no matter how much time it costs them. Families lock their doors before sundown, no matter how foolish it feels. Hunters do not follow blood trails after dusk, no matter how fresh they look. They know the truth that outsiders laugh at, the truth that has carried for more than 100 years. The bone grinder is no legend. The bone grinder is still out there. And if you ever find yourself stranded on the Laramie plains, with the wind pressing against your face and the silence growing too deep, listen closely. If you hear the crunching sound, faint at first, then louder, as though it is gnawing through your very bones. Do not look around. Do not call out. Do not step into the darkness. Because once the sound has found you, there is no prayer that will save you. All you can do is hope you are not the next to be ground into dust and scattered across the fields. Another forgotten name, carried away by the Wyoming wind.